Are we ready to go? Are the presenters ready? I see Nane Akua is not on there. Okay, 2 more minutes.
I'll do a couple of announcements before we start. Should I?
Yes, yes.
Hello, before the chair of this session takes over, just a few housekeeping things. One, we notice people looking for outlets. There are extension boards under your seats or under the table. Maybe even more importantly, we have had requests by people especially who are coming to Ghana for the first time that they would like some time to explore Accra a little bit. And we've looked at their schedule, and on Thursday, if we all keep to time, we can save some time and get us out of here early so that in the afternoon you can have some time to yourself to tour the city. So that's the aspiration, and of course it will depend on all of us trying to keep to schedule. So Thursday we'll propose how we want to reschedule the day so that we can have enough time at the end. And since I think we all want to do this, I hope we will work with the new schedule. So that's it for housekeeping, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Abugre to formally start the next session.
Thanks, Nane Akua. You're welcome back for the second set of presentations. Welcome those in the room, but also those online. So I hope those online are hearing us. If you have audio problems, kindly alert us so that can be adjusted. So we have 3 presentations for 3 group of countries. As we witnessed in the first set of presentations, there's a lot to be said, a lot of literature to condense over a very short period. This is not easy at any time, but I would like to plead that since we will all have an opportunity to read your papers in full, keep to the highlights. So as in the morning, each presenter has 15 minutes. If they could finish before 15 minutes, there is room, provides room for interaction. So that's the advantage. I would find a way to alert the presenter a couple of minutes before 15 minutes. And for those online, I probably will just wave my hand. So if you are presenting online, please watch my rather short limp. It will wave like this. Okay, so not to belabor, the first presenter is Professor Akua Anyidoho, who is presenting the cluster of Ghana and Nigeria, the Jollof feuding cousins.
We are behaving ourselves. The cousins are behaving themselves. We are getting along very well, aren't we, Mike and Hawa? So I'm presenting our synthesis, and this is the Ghana-Nigeria group. The team members are on the first slide. This is the outline that we suggested that we all use, so we are going to use this as well. We have a part one that looks at the trends over time in terms of ideologies, actors, and gendered and other dimensions of inequalities. And then that tries to look at thematic analysis, and then we'll get to some conclusions. So this is the part one. This is just a graphic to show that while there are differences in specific dates, the periodizations that we use for Ghana and Nigeria are somewhat in sync in that we can clearly identify a late colonial, early post-independence, era of crisis and adjustments, a post-structural adjustment period, and then the COVID period. Because Ghana and Nigeria were both unfortunately colonized by the same power, we tend to have had similar trends in social policy across the two colonies, moving from a state of, let's say, neglect, as the superpower in the region was too busy doing wars of conquest and focusing on exploitation of resources in the early stages to really worry about social policy making. So much of what was happening that we can recognize as nascent social policy was being done by churches and other charitable groups, and also by family and kin. This is important to remember. Communities, households, and family networks were the primary actors in what we call social policy making. But in the late colonial era, there was a move towards more deliberate and interventions in the area of social policy making. There was a focus on education and social security, and then other aspects of well-being were left to, again, churches and charitable organizations and family to take care of sort of social welfare. They were very deliberate about limiting resources in areas that could support the colonial enterprise, and so that would be education again, and maybe some areas of work. And then in other areas, they were content to supervise other organizations that were involved in provision of social welfare and other social services. Obviously, it was unequal, and it was deliberately so, because again, this was not about well-being of people, but rather about what will support the colonial enterprise. So it was very limited, minimalist, and created inequalities that we still see, that it privileged the southern areas, urban areas, men, formally educated persons, and formally employed persons. In the next slide, we look at the early post-independence era, where there was a nation building and status ethos for social policy making that was transformative in intent, even if it was not transformative in actual outcomes. Again, there was a focus on education and health, because this was very much a part of the human capital formation agenda to try to build modern citizens for a modern nation state and an industrial modern nation state. Okay. Since I can't rely on the screen, let me pull up my own slides here. Okay. So there was obviously an expansion of the scope and coverage from the sort of the limited coverage to certain Africans who could support the colonial enterprise to trying to extend it to all citizens. Again, that was the intent, although it may not have worked out in actual practice. So despite this expansion of coverage, despite this ambitious extension of especially education and health, because it was the same colonial apparatus and structures that were being built on, and maybe also because of perhaps a lack of resourcing, there were still disparities that you could see that were primarily regional and ethnic disparities. And it's also best mentioning that because the emphasis was on economic growth and industrialization, social policy, even though it was intended to be transformative, still played a secondary role to economic policy making. It was seen as the instrument to have growth. For the most part, I should mention though that of course there was also a social cohesion function at the time, that social policy was meant to try to make people feel like they belong to a nation and to make them identify with and be happy to be part of a new nation. But still, the main ethos was economic policy making for economic transformation. A lot has been said about the crisis and adjustment era, and I feel like it's fairly similar for a lot of countries on the continent, so I don't know that I'll spend a lot of time here. But just to point out that all the changes that were happening moved us from a status approach where, you know, the states took the lead in social policy making to a market-led approach. That meant that there was a shift in locus of power from the state to multilateral actors and also to private actors like businesses and civil society organizations. In Ghana and in Nigeria, and I'm sure in other countries, there was this era where everybody who had like a briefcase could set up an NGO, because the state was not to be trusted and the state was not seen as fit to do social policy. Then it was left to CSOs to come in to mop up after the to step into the gap that had been left by the state in terms of social provisioning. And obviously the social and economic hardships that this engendered marginalized people who had already been disenfranchised. There's a lot of literature that talks about how women in particular and women's livelihoods and women's work were greatly affected. There obviously would have been effects on people who were already poor and now being made to bear more of a burden for social provisioning and so on. We have a period beyond adjustment, and I put a question mark there because that's really a question about whether we've moved beyond adjustment, because we still have a liberal economic agenda with social policy seen more as a safety net. So at this period, we are seeming to equate social policy with social protection, which is a much more limited approach to doing social policy making, in that it focuses on the so-called marginalized, vulnerable, and poor, and it is meant to have a protection function to prevent things from happening to people and perhaps to try to elevate them out of poverty. But it doesn't focus on the entire population, and it doesn't try to do more than address problems that people have. There isn't the aspect of social policy making that's supposed to actually transform people's lives. So this is a very limited view of social policy making that we now have. And it's also worth noting that in this era, there's the deepening influence of so-called development partners. I put both in quotes because it's doubtful what kind of development they bring, and the partnership itself is in doubt. And also the growth of global development discourse. If you follow the analysis from the colonial time, you see that global actors and global development discourses have always been influential. That's how we came up with modernization and industrialization. But clearly in this era, there is much more naked and and present and salient in the way that we do social policy making. Then moving to the COVID era is really a continuation of the post-structural adjustment era. But I think in this period, we see, even in more stark terms, in greater relief, the weaknesses and inequities of the social policy regimes that we have, where there's more of a social protection orientation, where there's, hardships for workers and especially women in the informal economy, and where we see, again, in greater relief, gender, intergenerational, sectoral, and spatial inequalities. I have a next slide that just shows this graphic from Development Reimagined, this group that did some analysis of the kinds of responses that we had to COVID. I'm not sure whether it is clear enough for you, but you can see that across the continent, you had about 95 instances of social safety nets, so tax relief, cash transfers, loss of income relief, rent, mortgage freezes. And then at the last column, you see that there were only 5 instances of gender-focused policies. So this would include increased pay for female leaders in rural areas, cash transfers specifically to new mothers, and/or female empowerment protection programs. So that just shows you where we still are, where the emphasis is on social protection, but also social protection that is not gender equitable. In the next few slides, then I have 2 slides that look at thematic analysis. The first one is on the legacies of colonialism. I'm on the program tomorrow to talk about this more in depth, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I think the story in the 2 countries, reflects a lot of what was happening in at least the British colonies. But there's still a privileging of education and health. That is one of the things that we inherit, because, again, we are still about human capital development for economic growth. There is duality or pluralism in our social policy structures and regimes, where some people rely more on informal systems and other people, usually formally educated and informal work, are able to take advantage of formal systems. There are still inequities that we see that are still part of the legacy. And then we see social policy provisioning as paternalistic, used often as a tool by, politicians in exchange for loyalty and votes. The next slide talks about what we see as ideologies, approaches, and actors that have kind of been consistent over the periods. And I'm repeating myself here, but the ideology and goal of social policy for different governments across time has been human capital development, but the normative approaches have differed. So the specific ways that they have tried to achieve this has changed. So what we are seeing is that in the colonial era, there was more restricted and discriminatory provisioning of social services. Then in the immediate post-independence period, there was a status universal provisioning. During structural adjustment, there was emphasis on market-led provisioning. And then in the post-adjustment, we have some shared provisioning or shared responsibility for social policy between states and non-state actors. And all of this also then shows us the second point, that the role of the state has been dynamic, is expanded, then constricted, but the role of global actors has expanded over time. So in conclusion, we argue from all of this that the logic of neoliberalism persists, that social policy is seen as a way to help address the excesses of neoliberalism and to address crisis. So we have a minimalist social protection agenda instead of a transformative social policy agenda. And we suggest that the quest to build comprehensive and transformative gender equitable social policy would involve a few steps. One, appreciating the inequities of the existing social policy regimes, which is part of what we are trying to do here as a project. Thinking more carefully about how we can integrate formal and informal social policy arrangements, given that the majority of relations do depend on informal arrangements. Expanding our understanding of social policy beyond social protection. We need to really fight this attempt to limit social policy to social protection. That we should be thinking about expanding the focus of social policy beyond education and health to other aspects of human well-being that are also important and that might not fit a human capital development agenda, but is important for well-being. I'd like to just say, this is in response to an earlier comment, and I'm now using my co-PI hat here, that I know that for many of our presentations, we have not been able to tackle this last bit about how we move to a transformative agenda. Most of what we focused on in the first year is trying to understand how to where we are, and obviously we are hoping that in year 2 of the project, having had a better analysis of what the situation is, we can be more intentional and more what's the word? Deliberate and analytical in trying to recommend the way forward for a gender equitable and transformative policy for Africa. Thank you.
Professor is also a very good goalkeeper. Okay, so thanks very much. This is really on time. So fantastic. So that sets the standard. Because we don't have time, let's take the other 2 presentations. And let's hope that they also keep to 15 minutes so we can get back to reach a discussion on all 3 presentations effectively. So we have next the group of Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Angola by Carmeliza, Rosário. Is Rosário, you are here. Thank you. There you are. Yeah. Okay. Yes, for question.
Thank you. Hello.
It can actually come.
Yeah, that's why I've decided to. I sit on the table. Okay. Oh, I should switch to this one? Yes. Hello. As I was introduced, I'm representing the 9th cluster, which includes Angola, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. Unfortunately, our colleagues from Angola and Guinea-Bissau could not be here. Angola is having an election, and our colleague is monitoring the election, and it will be a very important elections are always important, but in Angola it's particularly so this year. And our colleague in Guinea-Bissau has just moved to Addis Ababa to a new position, and she couldn't be here either. And we miss them both terribly, but I'm here with our leader, Clementina, who is from Cabo Verde. I think some of the issues that have been said about colonialism and the inequalities that it produced are similar across regions, and I don't want to repeat myself, or repeat what has been said. We have divided our timeline into 4, not 5, as most have done. We have seen. We begin with 1933 to 1974. I think you can show the next slide. Thank you. And the reason why we chose 1933 and not before that is because this is when the Portuguese new state began, which was a corporativist state, and a lot of the legislative that legislative changes that occurred from what types of legislation existed started from that time that were very impactful and are the ones here, okay, that have an impact and are the ones that actually have a continuity, let us say, in the current legislation that we have. Most of the countries had their independences in 75. Guinea-Bissau had a little bit earlier. We are a bit unsure if it was 73 or 74. There was a long period of negotiation. But we sort of consider the post-colonial period to begin somewhere between 74 and 9, and it goes up until 1990, which is when the structural adjustments, they began a little bit earlier in the late 80s, but from then on, it really set off the economic changes that also affected a lot the practices of social policy. And we consider the fourth period, the latest period, which was from the Millennium Goals, the Millennium Declaration. It is a long period, and we did not consider a post-COVID because I think we are still in COVID, so we still need some time to see what kind of changes the COVID will bring. And a lot of the policies that were set during the COVID or because of COVID were temporary measures rather than structural changes as such. That's why we sort of include COVID within this longer period from the Millennium Declaration, because the ideology and the thought process is very much still linked to these Millennium Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in terms of comparative analysis of the patterns and trends in social policy over time in these 4 countries, as was said in the other countries, there was a racial separation ideology with separate politics for indigenous people and settler populations. And the economy was reliant on forced indigenous labor, and the policies that existed, the social policies that were linked to this forced indigenous labor, was to actually guarantee the health of this population for work, and of course, if there was education, is for them to satisfy the labor necessities. In terms of legislation, Cape Verde did not have the same indigenous law as the other colonies, and specifically the laws of indigenous separation were specific to Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. They had the same text, However, that did not mean that Cape Verde did not also have racial discrimination and differentiation between the so-called indigenous and settled populations. In the post-colonial period, all countries adopted a Marxist ideology, and the main point was to eliminate the imbalances caused by colonialism and try to give greater access to indigenous populations to what they did not have. And the focus was very much on education and health, and also on accommodation, so that the indigenous population could actually have access to these, and less so actually on work because of the nature of the extractive work that colonial economy had. With the structural adjustments, of course, as everyone has experienced worldwide, but in Africa in particular, there was a change into a multi-party politics and democratization. So politically, this is what happened. But economically and in terms of social policy, of course, it meant that we moved towards a market economy, divestment of the social sectors, and therefore there was a huge impact, and there were a lot of legislative changes, especially from this hopefulness of expansion of social well-being and equality for the population, the general population. And after the Millennium Declaration, the focus was on poverty reduction strategies. In particular, Cape Verde, Guinea, and Mozambique were the poorest of the countries. Angola less so because of the wealth that it has with the oil, which does not mean that they did not have inequalities in the country, but they were less focused on that, and they were very much into the market economy and hoping that the market economy would create a redistribution, social redistribution. Unfortunately, these poverty reduction strategies that created a lot of plans and strategies and programs became very sectoral and siloed, which means that there was very little intersectoral cooperation. Next slide, please. In terms of interest and institutional actors, we had the Catholic Church during colonial times that was an important actor, specifically regarding the education and the education of a local elite that then, of course, became also very important in the post-colonial time in terms of becoming the governing elite. Mozambique has a particularity in which the Protestant church or the post-Protestant missions were central to the independent movement, which actually means that the Catholic Church lost a lot of its influence in the post-colony or the post-colonial time, and was and still is sometimes associated with the opposition. However, the same process of churches being important for education has been there for all the countries. After independence, we moved on to a single party. In the case of Angola, it was MPLA, PAIGC in Cape Verde and Guinea, and Frelimo in Mozambique. So Cape Verde has had successful regime change, whereas the other countries actually have sort of these parties. In Angola and Mozambique, the parties continue, the independence parties continue in power. We will see what happens now in Angola. And in Guinea-Bissau, there has been a lot of instability since 1973, and we can't really say that there has been successful regime change, but there have been attempts, but there have been violent. After the millennium or structural adjustments, but coming into the millennium goals period, the development partners, bilateral partners and multilateral like the World Bank or the UN have been more influential, but they have varying and sometimes very contradictory interests. For example, when it comes with sexual and reproductive health, we know that the USAID is a big donor in terms of health, but for example, with the gag rule, it has some practices that are contradictory with what other development partners would prefer. In terms of ideologies, I think I've already mentioned this, but Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea have had post-independence wars and political instability. I think you can change the slide. And this has, of course, meant that a lot of the social programs and policies that were put in place were derailed in the war effort, but also in the sheer destruction of infrastructure, movement of populations, etc. And this has affected chiefly health and education sectors, but also the production, let us say, for example, in the rural areas, it has really impoverished the rural areas, and it has brought some pressure into the urban areas with the population movements. In the case of Cabo Verde, drought and desertification have had the same effect of not allowing for social policies to actually have the results that were expected or to be implemented as expected. On the other hand, in HIV/AIDS, the HIV/AIDS pandemic shaped policies and priorities in the health sector regarding sexual and reproductive health approaches and created lessons learned for the COVID pandemic. This is very much due to the sheer amount of investment that it had. In terms of the gender dimensions of social policy, women and children in colonial time were considered dependent of male workers, so they weren't really, I would say, if a woman was not married, let us say, it was not an individual to be considered in the law, so they only existed as dependents, and this sort of gives us an idea of what was the ideology behind what a woman was considered. In the post-independence, there was a rhetoric of women's emancipation. However, class trumped gender, and women were expected to focus on care work in the areas of education and health, and in countries like Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, it comes from the independence struggle in which even though they contributed to the war effort, these were some of the areas that they worked on. The policies targeting gender explicitly did not begin until the Beijing conference and the CEDAW. And subsequently, there were sectoral plans, so sectoral gender plans, empowerment programs, women poverty reduction strategies, and so on. And this included revisions of the family law, prevention of gender-based violence laws, etc. However, gaps do persist, and women continue to be among the most vulnerable to violence and poverty, among the least educated, and with least access to the formal market. Cape Verde has a parity law, as just to give an example, that has helped increase the percentage of women access to parliament. And the three countries, Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde, have above 30% representation in parliament. Guinea-Bissau does not. And in this, the instabilities, the political instability has had a lot of influence on the ability to create more equity. gender equity. Other dimensions of inequality, I think it has been mentioned that the rural and urban divide, regional divides that are in a way also affected by the political divide. There is a biased identification of vulnerable groups that is very much donor influenced, a persistent education gap between men and women, climate vulnerability in all the countries, and political exclusion is very important. Even in Cape Verde, where there has been a regime change, a successful regime change, in reality, political affiliation of a political party can determine inclusion or exclusion from the economy and even to access to social protection. I think I have very little time. I'll try to make it as fast as possible. So from the colonial legacies on social policy making, we have persistent inequalities that have been created since the colonial time. One of them is this rural-urban divide. There is an inability or an unwillingness to realize universal coverage for health, education, and social protection, and this has privileged urban populations and workers, so people with employment, formal employment, and so there are scores of people who are in the informal market who don't have access, the same access to these social benefits, even though, for example, health and education is supposed to be free or subsidized for everyone, but definitely social protection is very limited. There are deficient labor policies, which make of course, inability of youth, which makes the bulk of the population to access work, especially those coming from rural areas, even though education levels have been increasing. Deficient access of non-laborers and precarious laborers to social protection. One of the critiques has been that repayments of social protection assume that people are able to have continuous work throughout their lives, which is not the case. And there is a strong aversion to informal economy, and this comes from the colonial policies of not wanting to recognize informal laborers as part of the system or beneficiaries of the social policies. I will skip this one because I think I've already mentioned this. So in terms of overall critique of social policy making, what we think that has been good is there are new and inclusive policies promoting gender equity. However, there is weak implementation of such policies and legislation. So it's good that we have the legislation, but we need to be better at implementing them. There has been a revision and new legislation including all sectors. There is adhesion to treaties and international conventions, which shows good faith towards wanting to have more equitable, a more equitable society. And there has been a cooperation with civil society regarding implementation of social policies, which can be also negative. For example, in Mozambique, the access to safe abortion, which has been legalized, cannot be guaranteed because there is no public funding. And therefore, only the NGOs are providing these services. If they are not there, the service won't be there. So it's good to have a cooperation, but not to be excessively dependent. In the case of Cape Verde, there's a similar situation for the support of gender-based violence victims. So there is no public funding. It's a complete dependency on the civil society or development partners. What has been bad is this lack of cooperation between sectors, which makes it so that actually there is an increased inequality and exclusion in our opinion, because it is sectors privilege different populations and exclude other populations that other sectors might privilege. The reliance on the market ignores the incapacity of the market to absorb, especially women and youth. There is weak knowledge-based decision-making due to failure in data capture, and especially in disaggregated data, so there is very little that is known about what policies affect, how policies affect women in particular. And there is a weak appreciation of economic and social impact of policies. And this was specifically the case during COVID, and the COVID policies focused on sanitary challenges and neglected impacts, for example, on the informal market or that affects women. Now, this will be the last one, the opportunity for transformation. So these 2 slides ahead in social policy. What we think is that African customary practices in terms of relating to each other have a lot of reconciliation and mediating and pacifying actors and practices. So we think that our states, except maybe for the Cape Verdean states, have been very authoritarian, but they could be convinced in becoming more conciliatory and mediating between their role as state sponsors with the citizens, and having a more peaceful relationship with the citizens, with, of course, the mediation of pacifying actors. So far, sometimes churches have been these mediating actors, but maybe we could find others in the civil society, for example, and less antagonizing relationship. We think that there should be an improved articulation between the state and non-state actors and development partners to design inclusive but multi-sector public policies, not siloed public policies. There should be an increased budgetary expenditure of social sectors as part of an economic structural development agenda. So I think it has been mentioned already, this relationship between the economic development agenda and how this is interrelated with the social sectors. We think that there should be an integration of women's solidarity groups and existing social and traditional dynamics in the development of social policies. And we think here, of course, examples such as savings groups that are very common, and the practices of trust that they create, and an inclusive approach regarding the informal sector in development strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. No, secretly to myself, so you were on time. So thanks very much, very rich. And you can see the comparative similarities, differences between West African case studies and some Southern African case studies, and a whole range of things to discuss. So to save the time for this discussion, can I ask the Manu River group, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia? Please try and keep it within 15 minutes. Otherwise, we would listen to you and we can't ask questions. And we will walk around feeling rather disappointed. Bernadette, take it away.
Yes. Which one do I use? Thank you very much. We are the Mano River Union Group, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone. The fourth country is Cote d'Ivoire, but unfortunately, our sibling was removed from us during this project. But we hope that at the end of the day, it will be brought back. We followed the structure for presentation that was given to us, so I will just pass that. That is we had 5 periods and 4 sectors: agriculture, education, health, and labor. The 5 structures we all know about. I will skip the objective of the synthesis report and this workshop. We all know the objectives and what it's meant to achieve. In terms of methodology, the synthesis report is as a result of our individual country reports, and in there we use the documentary and literature analysis, we use key informant interviews and focus group discussions. Of course, we follow the periodization for the individual countries as far as possible. We have 1 or 2 anomalies when it comes to Liberia because of the history of their past. So we followed the thematic analysis of social policy making over time and then conclusion. This is the map of Mano River Union. We try to explore similarities and differences, but especially the major ones. The 3 countries have different political history. Sierra Leone was colonized by the British with different. Pardon? Okay. So can you go to Mano River Union area, similarities and dissimilarities? Next, okay. What was important really was that we had different political history. Sierra Leone was colonized by the British using divide and rule and decentralization. Guinea was colonized by the French, and they had a different approach. They used direct rule and centralization. Liberia was not really colonized in the true sense of the word, and therefore it was difficult for Liberia to actually fit in the early colonial period because they had a different trajectory. All 3 countries have experienced Ebola and also the virus. We have had counter coups and coups, and we have been ruled for some time by the military. We looked at the differences in languages: French, English, both British English and American English. The Mano River Union had the first ever female president in Liberia. And then, of course, Guinea was the first French colony to have gained independence in Africa. So all this also would have a determinate effect on the social policies of the time. We said Liberia could not fit into the late era of 1940s to the late 1950s because from 1840s to 1920s, for Liberia, we call that the era of the American Colonization Society. And that era, saw Liberia, slaves settling down in Liberia. There was no harmony between the indigenous people and those liberated slaves that came from America. We saw that in the policies that they developed, which was mostly after the American style.
the indigenous masses were used for tedious agricultural labor in concessions owned by the free slaves, and there was tension between the white-collared and the black-collared Liberians. The white collars called the Americo-Liberians. So this inequality even results into tension, and this tension still continues today. But for the two other countries, Sierra Leone and Guinea, of course, we were both colonized, and I said with the British and the French, different ideologies. But whatever was the different ideologies, their aims were the same, was to exploit the human, natural, and mineral resources to feed the industries back home. And therefore, even where they provided health services or insurance policies, all was geared towards giving them advantage in exploiting resources. If they built roads, it was to evacuate the resources and the products, from the hinterlands to the colonies, as they call it, or the metropole, so that it can be transported to the various countries. So the colonial period actually, in terms of gender empowerment, eroded the powers of the women. If we go further before the colonial era, literature says that, women in Africa were very strong. We had women warlords, and we didn't have this sharp gender division of labor in terms of crops, in terms of operations and all those things. But the introduction of monetized economy, the cash crop, and all those things actually relegated women to the periphery. The educational system was meant for the men to serve in the colonial administration. The women were to be good pastors' wives and homemakers and all of those things. So it did not really empower the African states, especially Sierra Leone and the two countries. Late colonial era, 1940s to the late 1950s, female and girl child education really was segregated, even in terms of the subjects that were taught in those schools. There were gender biases in policies, especially in health and also in agriculture and employment. The men worked mostly on the cash crops, and women on the food crops. So they didn't benefit from the monetized economy, even though they worked very hard also in the cash crop production. The early post-independence era saw multi-party political systems, plurality, and also the movement to provision of more mass and universal education. For example, we saw the establishment of agricultural universities in Sierra Leone and in Guinea and even in Liberia. And there was also move towards national languages as a medium of instruction, and there were a lot of policies also that were promulgated around this period in health, in education, in employment. But despite this, we saw that there were discriminations against the rural areas, the poor, female, the colored, and the light-skinned Liberians, Native and American named natives. So there was not much difference in the policies of the early colonial and even in the early post-independence era. We saw like Guinea and Sierra Leone organized women's cooperatives and gave them training in farming and marketing. We saw a lot of also gender activities. We saw the establishment of gender ministries or gender commissions, and also gender policies, especially to increase the empowerment of women in both elective and appointive positions. But despite all of this, we also saw free access, free provision of health services, payment of examination fees for secondary schools. This did not, however, translate into a good health status for the citizens. We saw increased budget allocation to some of the sectors, you know, but at the same time, the economy situation did not allow growth. So while in principle the transition from colonialism should have reflected social policies that were more concerned with qualitative change in citizens' realities in practice, both periods were characterized by limited social policy that did little to fundamentally improve the citizens' life. The era of crisis and adjustment, you know, we all know the triggers of the structural adjustment. This forced Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea also, you know, to go in for the Bretton Woods loans with very stringent conditionalities. So like cuts in expenditure on the social sectors really, you know, had effect on all the sectors, both the social sectors and the productive sectors. There was increasing inflation, dwindling gross national product per capita. Of course, there was discontentment. We saw within this period a lot of coups and counter-coups. All four sectors suffered as a result of the SAP conditionalities: currency devaluation, removal of subsidies, essential commodities, tax reform. As a result, all three countries' economies were in shambles. Prices of commodities skyrocketed due to currency devaluation, while inflation greatly affected wages and salaries. The educational system was not spared at all, especially in the rural areas. In the indicators of increased enrollment and retention, loss of jobs swelled the number of unemployed youth, especially in the rural areas. There was mass exodus from the rural areas. This period also coincided with the rebel war that was suffered in Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, but also at the same period, Guinea also had a lot of strikes, you know, due to dissatisfaction with the condition of living of the citizens. The period beyond adjustment, late 1990s to 2018, this period coincided with the rebel war in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and then the end of the rebel war in Guinea started in 2019. It was characterized by many post-conflict infrastructural, socio-economic, political, legal, and constitutional policy reform in all sectors. The education sector benefited from the rehabilitation or reconstruction of new and damaged infrastructure. There were new educational policies such as the 6334 system of education, curriculum revision, payment of fees, and also ensuring access to affordable health care meant that there were a lot of health policies that had to be revisited. Revitalizing the productive capacities of the employment sector that has been damaged, you know, a lot of mining services, agricultural services, we are not able to engage the citizens in a way that they could have effective livelihood activities. All the three countries were largely dependent on donor funding, community support for funding in the midst of severely limited human and technical capacities, especially the youth and women, and the inability to generate enough domestic revenues and pay wages. It was during this period that Ebola struck also in the three countries that actually exposed the vulnerability of the sectors that we are actually trying to regenerate after the war years. And we all know the effect of the Ebola crisis in these three countries. Very quick action interventions were adopted, but they were ad hoc, they were not far-reaching, and they were not long-term. And therefore, it did not bring in the empowerment that was required. These responses have been criticized as very temporal, limited in its effect, and concentrating on vulnerable groups instead of all persons affected by the pandemic. It was less empowering and welfare-focused as another shortcoming of these emergency transfers. Of course, the era of COVID actually also forestalled all development processes, even though it was short-lived. And for Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, the effects of the Ebola was far more devastating than that of COVID. Again, response mechanisms were put in place to varying degrees and measures. But the sectors were still hard hit, especially trade, tourism, transport, agriculture, fisheries, and manufacturing, and also the informal sectors and the small and medium-scale enterprises. Government had to come in with, and international organizations had to come in with quick fix responses, emergency cash and food transfers to vulnerable groups, hospitality sectors and small, medium enterprises and state-owned enterprises were bailed out. Of course, joblessness increased. The women and girls restricted during the period increased their vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence. The COVID structures lacked any gender sensitivity, as the governance structure of most COVID interventions were highly male-dominated. Emphasis on social protection measures in the employment sector focused heavily on those perceived to be most vulnerable, have not necessarily been gender sensitive, and there has not been much effort to broaden the productive base of the economy, expanding jobs, and thus potentially strengthening Ebola. Instead, the outbreak has shown that social policies are ill-suited to address the issues that the outbreak has brought to light, with policies not only being inadequate, but even having their adverse implications for both health and livelihoods of ordinary citizens. In terms of analysis of social policy making over time, what we found out that serious social policy was not considered in the early colonial rule of Guinea and Sierra Leone, and where social policy schemes existed, it was exclusively for the citizens of the urban or colony employed by the colonial powers or for white settlers. In the transition to independence, all three countries were exemplars of the developmental state, wherein the state felt that for development to take place was necessary to address social sectors like health and education to the detriment of maybe other sectors. While the expansion and intensification of capitalism in structural adjustment strengthened the need for social protection, paradoxically, the call for a more limited state and for a reduction in social spending meant that social protection policies could not address the widespread poverty and suffering that citizens faced. For some scholars, it was the retrenchment that exacerbated the impact of Ebola outbreak, coming as it did on the back of broken health care systems that have been weakened by both war and low spending on health. While the call to strengthen all sectors, particularly the health system, was one of the most urgent after the Ebola COVID-19 outbreak has underscored how weak the effort at rebuilding really were. Similarly, we have to note that it revealed the continuous weakness of social policies. In conclusion, there has been no shortage of social policies across sectors in all three cluster countries, as has been witnessed by the plethora of policies, actions, institutions throughout the 5 era of study. Legislations have been enacted and institutions established to oversee the implementation of social policies in this country. Some political will can be said to have existed to ameliorate citizen suffering during emergencies of any kind from government and non-governmental organizations. However, social policy initiatives and programs in all three countries and across all 4 sectors have been and continue to be heavily underpinned by colonial policies and paradigm, even in post-independence era. The initiatives have been heavily donor-dependent on funding, thereby making them unsustainable. The size of social policy initiatives and programs have been rather ad hoc, with little potential for transmitting the lives of the recipients in a more empowering manner. Cash and food transfer has constituted the main response in times of emergency to cushion vulnerable and poor society members with a limited time span to adequate resources at the disposal of the government. They focus on mostly poor, vulnerable, and marginalized citizens with social policy initiative and program instead of the whole population, taking into consideration the specific situation and needs of each group, has tended to dip in poverty due to the fluid and transient nature of vulnerability. The gendered impact of social and economic policy has been largely ignored. Although women play critical roles in all sectors of focus, there is a near absence of women in the design, structures, and implementation of social policy implementation, as clearly observed in both Ebola and COVID-19 response structures and measures in Sierra Leone. As a result, issues of importance and concerns to women and girls are often overlooked, trivialized, and ghettoized. Comparatively, social policies have generally been gender blind in design, with women benefiting less than men, despite some improvement to women's empowerment through appointment to executive arms of governance and elections to the legislature and local government. This call for a reorientation of policymakers, donors, and development practitioners to be gender conscious and informed when planning, designing, and implementing emergency response measures, since such responses are never gender neutral in their effort. I thank you. Merci beaucoup. Obrigado. Asante sana. Shukran.
Thank you, Bernadette, for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation. So we have 3 really rich and interesting presentations to discuss. If we don't want to go late for lunch, we have 20 minutes to discuss. If I see that you are really active, we shall continue discussing and let lunch be postponed to tomorrow. Right? So I assume that you would rather eat. In that case, may I ask first those online? There's a discussion. There is a discussion. I am so sorry. There is a discussion. So I have rushed you towards lunch. My apologies. Deborah. So Deborah, you have 10 minutes. You can use that. Try that, let's see.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I think this is okay. And I promise you I won't do up to 10 minutes. Thank you very much for having me. I thank the organizers for putting this conference together. I like the theme very much, and I think it's very timely as we begin to think about COVID recovery. Although our presenter indicated that we are not entirely in a post-COVID era, COVID still lingers around. We still have to think about recovery and how we can, pick the bits and pieces that are left after the damaging effects of COVID. So thank you, presenters. I absolutely enjoyed the presentation, and I find your work very insightful. And it's also really insightful to hear you catalog all these policies that we have in the regions that you have worked in. And I have a few reflections. I must say that I didn't get to read the papers because I got them this morning, but I have skimmed through them, I have listened to you, and I think that there's quite a number of issues we can reflect on. And so I won't do so much of, presenter kind of submission, but very general, and I think quite a bit about how the periodization has been set up. I know this may be from the project design perspective. And I say this because starting from colonial era, I think is a bit problematic. I heard someone express the same sentiment. And it's very difficult to really put aside an entire era, pre-colonial era, and then say we are starting from a particular point. That kind of compartmentalization may be very problematic for, you know, as you progress in the project, where you think more about where do we move from here, what do we do, because definitely our history tells on how things are happening and what we want to do. I think also that perpetuates a certain rhetoric that, you know, Africans do not have a history. And so even from an intellectual political stance, I think that we should go beyond our colonial era and see how the happenings, including some of it which persists, the cultures, how they reflect on how social policy is constructed and shaped, and how they work, and probably also how they do not work. All of that is very important. And I heard some of those in the presentation from the Cape Verde, Guinea, Bissau, Mozambique, you know, cluster, where you talk also about culture and how culture also, you know, at least that is acknowledged somewhere in your presentation. And please pardon me if some of these exist in the other work. I definitely haven't had the opportunity to do a thorough reading, but I'm just raising some of these issues for our consideration. I like the intersectoral analysis from the Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia group. And I thought also in the earlier presentations, I thought about how the sectors have been segmented, and definitely things flow into each other. So agriculture and economics and health and even education, they flow. And so although you may have designed it in a way that you are looking at things in terms of sectors, definitely also pay attention to intersectoral issues. And the thing also about, in analyzing all these policies, I struggled to see the transformative agenda and effects, how they have been operationalizing it. And Anekua, you were right in saying, for instance, you know, some policies have transformational intent. You know, so that may be the intention, but even the intention has to be crafted in a way that it becomes possible to execute. So if these policies lack these things, I think this project, that's one of the great things that you could highlight, that even from the crafting, because a lot of times we are thinking about the fact that if we have just done gender disaggregated, you know, data, we have it is in there. If we have targeted women, is in there. But all of us know that it needs to move beyond that into where it is touching on the core norms that perpetuate the inequalities that we see. So as you review these policies and work on them and do research and so on and so forth, look at them. If it's not there, bring it up and let us know. And then it may be picked on for future work and so on and so forth. And I was happy I heard again, you know, the contextual issues of war and Ebola. And of course, we can even broaden it to other, you know, health issues. And there are many more which are increasing in our sub-region and so on and so forth, even the NCDs. How do our social policies address these? And Cape Verde group, Carmeliza, when you talked about care, for instance, that is an area where, you know, in this university, in the Institute of African Studies, for instance, we've done some very great work there. Care, in social policy. It's so important. And that makes me think about the tension between the neoliberal agenda of social policy and the well-being agenda. And Akua, you talked about well-being, highlighted in your work. And I have always thought that so long as we apply rational choice and neoliberal paradigm in doing social policy, it becomes counterproductive. Because some of it will not generate or will not make economic sense, but it would definitely make well-being sense. And a lot of times I read, for instance, if it has to be a policy on education, most of it is calculating and looking at how much of it will yield to productivity. All that is really valid and nice, but we will not always have it resulting in some productivity, some profit, some money. It will not always happen. Sometimes you just need to spend and have these policies on people who are dependent and they are vulnerable because they need it and they are part of society. And that's where the issue also of social justice comes into this whole discourse. What is just? What is fair? As against what makes economic sense. And I know that because in your periodization, you're also looking at, you have this era where there's economic reforms, and all those reforms are underpinned by debt and the need to, redeem economies. That, element is very strong and influences how we do the analysis, but we can't move beyond that. So just to fulfill my promise to the chair, I will not go on and on, but then I will also talk about the big C's. As you move into the next phase, there's some discussion about, the era in which we are is COVID, is costs, because there's a lot of inflation and all that is happening, not just COVID, but Ukraine, everything. And then climate change. I missed climate change in the discussions. It may be in there, but then it's important. If you are looking even at the sectors, it's education, health, and accommodation. But as I've said, these sectors are not discrete in themselves. Many things, overlap. So think also about the big C's. But I think you've done a great work. This is a great place to start, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Deborah wasn't here when we introduced ourselves, so just to mention that Deborah Atobrah is the director of the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana here. So thanks again very much. Okay, so we have 10 minutes to lunch. May I ask your indulgence for an extra 10 minutes for discussion? So we go to lunch 10 minutes later. Will you accept that? Okay. So on that basis, let me just find out whether there's anybody online who might want to ask a question. So IT people, is there anybody online? Yes, could we start with them? And it's for if you are hearing me, who is the first online? Who is online? Yes.
Allô?
Yes.
Je suis Rose Delimad.
Okay.
Je suis du cluster Burkina, Côte d'Ivoire, Bénin.
Excellent. Please, can I ask you to keep it within 2 minutes?
Okay.
So please go ahead. Can you hear me? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Voilà. Je voudrais dire merci aux présentateurs des différents clusters. Et ma question s'adresse principalement au cluster Mano-River. On a vu dans l'histoire que le Liberia est la Sierra Leone ont été des pays fortement impactés par la guerre. Et moi, ma question, c'est de savoir à quel moment est-ce que les politiques sociales sont mises, je dirais, en place ou sont mises en œuvre dans une situation de conflit. Est-ce que les conflits vont impacter la mise en œuvre de ces politiques sociales ou bien au contraire? Voici un peu, je dirais, ma préoccupation. Merci.
Thank you very much. Can we take one more from online? If there's any, there's none. Okay. Can we take a few more so that they can just answer rather than one after the other? Any questions? If you are making a comment, keep it brief. But any questions to any of the panelists? So there are, yes, please. I can't see from here, so I can't read the names.
All right. Would like to thank the presenters for such interesting presentations. My question goes to to all the presenters. Yeah, it talks about the issue raised by the online speaker, where it talks about a social policy in post-conflict situations.
A bit closer to the mic.
Okay. Social policy in post-conflict situations. What role social policy can play in areas where there's been conflict, particularly in terms of the wounds which might have been created during the conflict. Yes. So, yeah. So I also believe that maybe social policy might play different roles depending with the context. So which means in the case of Liberia, the Guinea-Bissau, also issues of Mozambique and also Angola, the war period and the post-war period, the kind of social policy which might have emerged and how social policy can play or create a critical role on that one. Then the second one talks to issues of, especially to Liberia, issues of social policy and migration is another important theme, where we see maybe those slaves from America being imported to Liberia, and the situation which was created maybe from that particular situation. And also you see a repeat of the same again, like now the UK sending those asylum seekers to Rwanda. So you might draw some similarities through those experiences. Then we might have a comment on that as well from the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other? Yes, please. Please keep it brief.
Thank you, Chair. I have, I think, 3 comments. One, on the first group, that's Ghana and Nigeria. I have liked the comment that after the crisis, the role of the state was dynamic, and also that the role of the global actors has been expanding. And that is my concern now. If it has been expanding, has it been doing so for the good of gender transformation or not? Because that's the question we should ask. If it is for good, how have we been leveraging this expansion to ensure that we make gender transformative policies? If they are not for good, what is the way forward? Because I think that's where we get locked up as African countries. We have the resources. Instead of mobilizing our resources to respond to social development challenges, we are there leaving it to others, and that's why we see this expansion. So these are the questions. 2, the presenter from Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Angola, Mozambique, also concluded that, which is a genuine conclusion, and I think we all have this in our findings, that women are still vulnerable, and that is very true. Now, I wanted to find out from this cluster whether they found out also some kind of women's response to this kind of vulnerability. What are they doing? What are they doing as women's group or activists? Are they there, and what are they doing? If they are doing something, are there challenges they are facing? I know you talked about authoritarian regimes, which is frustrating or pacifying some of these actors. But precisely what are these women's group facing is what I want to know, because unless we identify some of these and overcome them, we shall be talking about gender transformative policies, but to no avail. And lastly, this group covered these sectors of health, accommodation, and agriculture. But I remember also when we were submitting our proposal for this, we also included agriculture, but it was rejected by, I think, a reviewer, that agriculture is really, there's no social policy in agriculture. So I simply want to be educated from this forum whether agriculture is also contribute to social transformation or not. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay, we have 3 interventions. So very quickly, starting from the gentleman in the yellow shirt, and then the next, and and we finish.
Thank you. I will be very brief. Now, I would like to know if there is any link between oil production and social policies in oil production countries such as Mozambique, Nigeria, Ghana, and so on. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Oui, moi j'aimerais poser une question en rapport avec le système colonial et je vais revenir sur l'intervention de la discutante. Premièrement, est-ce que le système d'indirect role a influencé particulièrement les politiques sociales coloniales par rapport au système du direct role chez nous, les francophones? Parce que dans l'indirect role, les communautés locales avaient un plus grand rôle et avaient donc l'opportunité d'implémenter la culture. Est-ce qu'il y a une remarque particulière dans les politiques sociales modernes en rapport avec l'indirect role? Et cette question se rapproche de l'intervention de la discutante sur la nécessité d'aller au-delà. Moi, je conceptualiserais même les politiques sociales traditionnelles. Est-ce qu'on gagnerait par les structurer? Là, c'est même pour tous les pays, c'est pas seulement... et la problématique de l'adaptation des politiques sociales traditionnelles, ce qu'on peut récupérer et valoriser. Je prends l'exemple, au Cameroun, l'enseignement primaire et maternel est contrôlé à plus de 80% par les femmes. Donc, il y a des mécanismes d'adaptation pour mieux repenser nos politiques. Is all.
Thank you. Prof.
Thank you very much. So, the Mano River Union, in both the reports and the presentation, especially in the case of Liberia, the sense one gets is that in the period we are calling colonization was the period that the American Colonization Society was in charge. One of the things that was curious that in almost all the reports, in British colonial Africa, French colonial Africa, and Portuguese colonial Africa, the earliest forms of social policy were clearly discriminatory on the basis of race. But it's also curious to notice that in Liberia, the Africans who were shipped down, who constituted part of the American Colonization Society, also instituted social policies that discriminated against the indigenous Africans. And I find that to be curious. I don't know whether I'm even asking a question or I'm just stating an observation, but that's something that I'm curious about. But again, also on the same cluster, the Mano River Union, it does appear to be that the countries in that cluster, the period that we are calling crisis and adjustment, for them, there was a twin crisis. There was the usual crisis, the basis upon which structural adjustment was imposed across Africa. But for these 3 countries too, there was also the political and civil crisis as well. it will be interesting to hear a bit more about the fate of social policy during this period, whether it was completely dead, and whether there were any efforts at all, and who were delivering it. Was it NGO or the state that was almost in collapse also? And so, but also in the report itself, particularly in the case of Sierra Leone, as one reads it, you move from the colonial era straight to the adjustment period. The period immediately after colonial rule in Sierra Leone was missing in the report. I don't know if this is deliberate or it was collapsed into any other period. Thank you.
Okay, so now one burning intervention. Okay, please do, but keep it brief. It's the last one. Yes.
Alors, donc, c'est le professeur Ousmane Ouagé du groupe Afrique de l'Ouest, Mali, Sénégal et Mauritanie. Merci beaucoup. J'ai écouté depuis ce matin, bien sûr, un ensemble d'interventions des colistaires. Moi, j'aimerais juste faire un petit constat. C'est que les parcours, bien sûr, de ces trous, de ces groupes de pays est presque identique. Parce que vraiment, sous la colonisation, il y a eu quelques politiques éparses. Et le vrai problème a commencé avec surtout la colonisation ou avec l'indépendance où nos États ont poursuivi des parcours instables dans lesquels différentes politiques ont été élaborées. Ensuite, il y a eu bien évidemment les PASS, le programme d'ajustement structurel, donc qui ont vu un certain nombre d'États entreprendre des parcours divers. Je vais m'attarder un tout petit peu sur, bien sûr, cette période des années 20 jusqu'à la période post-Covid. Moi, ce que j'aimerais juste faire un constat, c'est que malheureusement, c'est-à-dire, je dis bien malheureusement, parce que nos États ont entrepris un certain nombre de politiques sociales et d'assistance aux pauvres. Et la plupart des politiques, c'est l'assistance directe par les biais des cash transferts et entre autres, exactement. Et sur ce point, j'ai comme l'impression qu'on est en train de fabriquer...
Kindly ask a question, so we don't do another lecture.
C'est juste une intervention. Juste un petit point à ce niveau. J'ai comme l'impression qu'on est en train de préparer une nouvelle génération d'assistés. Puisque avec la Covid et toutes ces répercussions, on est en train de préparer le nombre de pauvres ou bien le nombre de demandeurs est en train d'augmenter dans nos États. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour transformer cette assistance justement en politique sociale capable de donner du travail et de rendre justement ces mendiants et ces pauvres d'une façon générale maîtres d'eux-mêmes, c'est-à-dire dans la mesure, dans une situation où ils pourraient se prendre en charge à travers des petites entreprises, de l'entrepreneuriat, de vivre contre le travail, etc., etc. C'est là, je m'arrête là et je vous remercie.
Okay, thank you. So let's take a round of responses, starting from Carmeliza. If you want to pick anything at all.
Thank you. I think I will pick two, but I think I will start with something that I found very interesting about what Deborah commented on our presentations, which is the issue of care in social that there is this tension between the well-being agenda and the neoliberal agenda, and I think you're absolutely correct. That I think when we were mentioning something about a state that is conciliatory, it is a state that doesn't think only on economic terms, because having a reconciled and pacified, in a good sense, peoples whose needs are addressed also allows for prosperity. That includes economic prosperity. So I think you're onto something really strong, and I think we need to stress this better. How do we make it relevant within our own cultural context and the way we think about and relate to conflict, and I'm mentioning conflict because Mozambique is a country and the other countries, except maybe for Cape Verde, have a lot of conflict. So how do we get out of conflict and have this prosperous these countries that focus on well-being of everyone, so not just on the economics. So I think that is a good point. And that takes me to this question about oil production and how this is related to social policies. I think they have been related in different ways, in the sense that in the case of Angola, the oil production, what was thought, and this is the market thinking, that with the good economics it will trickle down into social welfare. And this is not the case. It's the hope, and it is what is hoped, that the economy then will trickle down into social welfare. And this is the logic or the ideology of how they are connected. And there are other approaches. In the case of Mozambique, or in some cases, people have tried to read case, which is the sovereign fund in social well-being, social protection, and the future generations. So, whichever the case and whichever the ideology, the idea is that the ability of having funds to fund social policies is important, and this is how the economy is linked to social policies, irrespective of the economy. So, in many of our cases in which we actually depend more on agricultural production or other sectors that are not as wealthy, it's still, I think the thought behind is that we still need to find ways to fund our social policies, to fund the well-being of all our citizens. And the general consensus is that this is possible, irrespective of how rich we are. So, and I think this is what we need to be thinking about, how to make this possible. And I think it was mentioned something about with our own funds, not just donors. We need to think about our own wealth and our economies and how to fund ourselves. And this is how we can make it.
Thank you, Bernadette. So many questions to you.
Thank you very much. Somebody asked the question, how did Liberia and Sierra Leone during the war whether they were able to promulgate any social policies? If yes, how were they able to implement it? The answer is yes. Even in the midst of the war, we were able to implement some policies. Because you see, sometimes the war moved from one part of the country to another. Life did not come to a complete standstill, during our 11-year war. For example, in 1996, the people agitated for multi-party democracy elections. Some of the parts of the country were behind rebel lines. So what did we do? We adopted the PR system. Our constitution talks of the first past the post. And for us to do that, we need to have census. We couldn't do census. So we had to go and amend some aspects of our constitution so that we can do first past we can do PR system, just so that we can have elections. So, and during that, after the elections in 1996, we also instituted the policy of paying for transitional exams, from primary school to secondary school and university. Because the parents were poor, they didn't have anything. So government had to pay for all the West African examination councils for everybody who was in the transitional classes, And that social policy is still going on. In fact, it has reduced dropout, between those transitional classes. It has also increased girl child education, because sometimes when the girls go to those classes, if parents have too many children and they don't have the money, it's the girls that drop out first. So we are able to implement some of those policies. Of course, it will be interrupted either as the war escalates, or maybe you don't have money because the revenue collection drew down, and the industries were closed, the rutile, the bauxites were closed, so your revenue generation was low. But we are able to implement some, not all. And then somebody said, we started in the proposal writing, agriculture was one, but it was dropped. I can't remember because for Africa especially, most countries in Africa, we are an agricultural agrarian-based economy. So if you are talking of social policies, you know, I don't think you can leave agriculture behind, because what you implement in health and education, they have intricate relationship. A healthy workforce leads to healthy, good production. A weak, poor health population cannot produce. You see, an illiterate population that cannot have access to information on improved agricultural practices cannot increase. So for us in Sierra Leone, in our Mano River Union structure, we use all 4 clusters: agriculture, health, education, and employment. Employment is so important in our subcultures. You know, we have mining organizations, mining businesses. So social policies can also impact on employment. Yeah, so we thought that agriculture was important, so we left it. You said you didn't see our presentation on the post-immediate independence. We have it. It is there. I just, as we are talking, I just went to our individual clusters, you know. It's here, early post-independence era, late 1950 to 1960. And for every periodization and for every sector, you know, we discussed it. So it's there. I don't know what has happened, but it's there. We are very conscious about it. In my presentation, we focused on all 5 periodization, of course, and then a little bit on Liberia, you know, which was a different case. So I think it's there. I don't know which other questions. Okay, then the indirect rule. You see, the difference between the French colonizers and the British colonizers was that the British used indirect rule. That means they recognized the traditional authorities that were already in place, and they helped them rule. They used them when they wanted to implement policy. It was easy for policies and laws, you know, to trickle down and be implemented if you walked through the existing structures. So the indirect rule had an implication on social policy in our countries, especially, you know, Sierra Leone, where we had paramountries. And if you take, for example, the Ebola era, we were able to turn around the curve because the government, after having done everything and the curve was just going up, now went down to the communities, to the traditional leaders. You see, we revere our dead. We wash them, we want to do everything. So how was government going to ensure that? One of the fastest way of infection was when you touch dead bodies, you know, who died as a result of Ebola. So the traditional leaders were called, they were used, and even Ebola, the lessons were, you know, also transferred to COVID by using the traditional leaders, you know, to ensure that there were bylaws, you know, when visitors entered any village, you go straight to the traditional leaders and say, I'm here, so that they know your movement, they know where you are coming. So without the traditional leaders, you know, in our countries, you know, some of us, we could not have changed the direction of the curve because they are on the ground, they know the issues, they know their people and so forth.
Thank you. I don't want us to give too much credit to the British. The reason they used indirect rule was because they were clearly too focused on resource exploitation and not that interested in doing much for the population. Let's also remember that they also created, created traditions. There's this famous book about imagined traditions. So they created so-called traditional structures and changed them for their own good. So it wasn't benign, and yeah, we don't want to give them too much credit for that. They also did a lot of harm in trying to reinvent. That's the one, reinvention of tradition. That's the book. I want to pick up on Deborah's comments about the way we seem to have ignored what existed before the advent of, colonialism. That was not the intent. I think we're trying to focus on the periods where there were some concerted, sort of coherent attempts at social policy making. We are certainly hoping, and I think it was evident in the synthesis report that we gave from our cluster, that we recognize the existence and persistence of indigenous and private, mostly informal social policy regimes and structures. And we certainly hope that in the analysis this will be taken into account. In fact, tomorrow, Mike is going to give a presentation on indigenous and informal social policy structures and how they intersect with the more formal structures that we are talking about. So certainly as a project that is based in the Institute of African Studies, we would not make that mistake of pretending that we didn't have a history before colonialism, happened to us. I also appreciated your comments about contextual issues. And while you were talking, it occurred to me that for our cluster, we hadn't talked about the Ghana and Nigeria's history of immigration and repatriations that happened in the 1980s, where we sent people back and they retaliated by sending a whole bunch of Ghanaian immigrants in Nigeria back at us, and what that meant for our social policy context. So thank you for reminding me that that's an important context to bring up. Just on the question of how structural adjustment changed the direction of social policy making on the continent, I wanted to bring in a little nuance, because we have a section on post-structural adjustment, which I suggested in my presentation is not really post anything, where it's a continuation. But I did want to mention that there is, like, as a colleague of mine used to say, repetition with a critical difference. So in the post-structural adjustment, we still have neoliberalism maintained as the prevailing logic, but an attempt to accommodate social dimensions that it had previously ignored. And you see that in keywords that we hear now about safety nets and pro-poor growth and social inclusion and gender equality. But the assumption still appears to be that social policy can provide sort of cosmetic reforms to address the excesses of neoliberalism. And I just wanted to bring a few examples. I think I left my presentation at a level of abstraction. But what I mean by this is that you have employment schemes for young people, but these are initiated to produce jobs that the neoliberal economic reforms have failed to produce or to provide. So you have cash transfers, but these are designed to support livelihoods that neoliberal policies have actually undermined. And then you have school feeding programs that are created to ameliorate the situation of hunger and food insecurity that have been created by these policies. So while we do see that structural adjustments came, and well, we accepted it and it has continued, I just wanted to bring this sort of nuance about how we are trying or pretending that we are moving away from it with all these band-aids, but these band-aids are addressing the problems that have been produced exactly by these kinds of policies. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Can you give the panel and the discussant a big hand of applause? May you enjoy your food and don't choke on it. We are back in 40 minutes. Thank you very much. And may you give the chairman a hand of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Any announcements? Thank you.
So we have lunch, which is ready right where we had the snack earlier on. And as the chair
just indicated we have 40 minutes. Sorry if you feel rushed, but we have 40 minutes to get that done. And then we come back to have the last section for today. Thank you.